So, last thing we have talked about is how to create an AWS S3 bucket. Okay, now one of the important thing also that is related to this small ETL that we will create is to create an identity and access management configuration. Okay, so to create an S3 buckets, we need, as I said, to set some configurations, and also we need a policy. What does it mean, this identity and access management? What does it mean? It is a framework of policies, a set of policies, okay, and technologies to ensure that the right users have the appropriate access to the technology resources. S3 bucket is a resource. We need to ensure the right users that should have access to S3 buckets. Our S3 bucket is a resource. We need to define who can have access to our resources. So the resources, so the identities, they are users, roles, or groups, or a resource within the AWS account groups. So the identities that we will grant them the permission to access, to read, to write to our S3 resource, to our S3 bucket, they are either users, a person, a developer, a group of developer, a group of users, or something called rules. Or a resource, we can give a resource the permission, okay, to write, to read to our resource. So at the end of the day, we have four things: users, roles, groups, and a resource within the AWS account groups that will have the permission, okay, will have a permission or a set of permissions defined with a policy. These permissions, it will be defined within a policy, either to be allowed or denied to access our resource. What does it mean to access? It means that to perform an action on a specified resource. So, to summarize, authentication or identity management is an AWS identity and access management. It consists of the following identities: users, which interacts with the AWS resources from the AWS console, and the AWS CLI, command line interface. By default, a new AMI user has no access to any resource. This is by default. Or groups consists of IAM users and permissions assigned to those users. Or rules, an IAM rule is an entity with a specific set of permission. Okay, what does it mean, a rule? It is an entity that AWS services, users, or application can assume to gain temporary permissions to perform actions on AWS resources. They are typically used to delegate access within or across AWS accounts, allowing users to or services to assume a role within a specific set of permissions. So a rule is not a person, is not a developer. It is something that contains permissions, a set of permissions, a set of policies. These role can be assumed, okay, as a user, a service, or application can assume to gain temporary permissions, okay. So a role is something different than user, is something different than a group. A user is someone that we give him the permission, we give him the policy. A group, it's also like users. But a rule is an entity by itself. It's an entity by itself. It has specific set of permissions. We grant these permissions temporarily to some other identities or resources. So again, a role is an identity that you can create in your AWS account and assign specific permissions. Okay, it's an identity different than user, different than group. You can define in your AWS account, as we will see in the hands-on, and you can assign to it specific permissions, and then you can give that role to other identities. Okay, so an identity and access management role is similar to an IAM because it is an IAM identity that has specific permissions associated with it. These permissions determine what the identity can and cannot do. So a role is a set of permissions. It is different than a policy. Okay, it's not a policy, it's different than a policy. It's a group of policies, different policies together. Okay, and we can give these different policies that we called rule to other identities. So we can give a role to a user, we can give a role to a group of users. Okay, we can give a role to resources. One significant difference between an IAM rule and an IAM user is that a rule is assumed by anyone who needs it. Okay, is assumable by anyone who needs it. A user needs this role, can take it. A group need this role, can take it. A resource need this role, can take it. A role does not have standard long-term credentials like password associated with it. It's not like a user. The user can have a password, okay, to access. A role, no. It is a set of permissions, a set of policies. It's different. You see the differences between them? This is the difference. So AWS generates a temporary security credentials when an IAM rule is assumed. So to summarize, an IAM is a framework of policies and technologies to ensure that the right users have the appropriate access to technology resources. An AWS IAM policy defines the permission of an identity, users, groups, and roles, and or a resource within the AWS account. An AWS IAM policy regulates access to AWS resources to help ensure that only authorized users have access to specific digital assets. So the permissions defined within a policy either allow or deny access for the user to perform an action on a specific resources. So we have a policy. Within that policy, we have the permission either to allow or deny access to perform an action on a specific resource, either to give you permission or not to perform an action. So the IAM policies can be either identity based, like this, or resource based like this. Identity based policies are attached to an identity, a user, group, or role, and dictate the permissions of that specific identity. In contrast, a resource based policy defines the permissions around the specific resource by specifying which identities have access to a specific resource and when. Okay? Identity based policies and resource based policies both uphold IAM security standards and give organizations flexibility with how to best set up their resource management strategy to meet their needs. So both identity based or resource based are for authentication, for getting permissions to perform actions or not to perform action. We have user, we have role, we have a group. Role and policy are two things different. A role is granted, is assumable by identities, okay? However, a policy is something that contain permissions to do or not to do, okay? That's it. Hope it is clear.